Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Nerd to the Third Power, your one-stop shop for all things nerdy and awesome. I am your host and master of ceremonies, Dr. Gonzo. With me, as always, this epic quest of awesomeness is our resident anime goddess, the Cat. Cat, how are you doing?
I am very tired today. I'm not in a great mood because my computer decided to run a bunch of updates like right as I was supposed to be recording. So fuck you, computer.
You and everybody else who's running Windows 10. That's like that's the big story in the tech world right now is a forced Windows 10 update that has just like thrown a wrench in all of the things.
Thanks for nothing, Windows.
All right, but we got a fun show for you tonight. We're discussing something that might be a little bit outside of our normal wheelhouse, but we thought would be kind of cool to talk about, given that we're in the middle of our Halloween Spooktober month, and that is we're discussing Stephen King, more specifically his Hulu television series Castle Rock, which is set within the Stephen King multiverse, and we're also going to talk about some of our favorite Stephen King stories, and his contribution to horror and to nerddom. So, but of course, we are going to begin, as always, with our random topic of the week. And last week, we talked about Halloween candies that we got for trick-or-treat that we loved and that we hated, and we got some really good responses here. Kat, we got a response here from Ricky, and he shares your distaste for the candy buttons that you spoke about last week, those candy dots on paper that you received. I can't read his entire message here because he uses a lot of really colorful language, but the gist of it is he absolutely hates candy buttons. He says, every time I see one now, I still gag.
True story.
A lot of people also don't like the circus peanuts. Sarah here writes that she would get them in her bag. Fortunately, she never had to eat them because she had a set of those parents that were paranoid about people lacing the candy, and because the circus peanuts always came unwrapped, her parents would throw them away.
That's a good parent.
Yeah, that is someone who loves their child right there. Someone who good parents don't let their kids eat circus peanuts. All right, and let's see here now. Here's one that I got really kind of surprised because I absolutely love these things. But we got one here from Peter, who he hates blow pops.
Really?
For those who don't know what blow pops are, they're lollipops with bubble gum on the center of them. They're kind of a spin-off of the Tootsie Roll Pops. So he says he absolutely despises them, not because of the bubble gum, but because all the flavors just taste way too tangy for him.
Oh, I guess that's fair.
Okay, and let's see. Here's another one here from Lisa. She hates Hubba Bubba. She absolutely hated them because she thinks that they taste like chalk, which, okay, I can see. You've had Hubba Bubba before, right, Kat?
Yeah, actually, I can't chew gum anymore because I have TMJ, so I miss all gum. Like, I just loved chewing gum so much, and I can't do it anymore because it causes excruciating pain, but I do miss Hubba Bubba.
Okay. And then we also got some favorites here. We have one here from Mark, and he writes that he shares my father's, quote, sexual love of Reese's Cups.
Your father's sexual love that we definitely didn't need to know about.
Yeah. To borrow a line from Chris Evans, that's not going away anytime soon. And let's see. Eric here, he writes that if he'd grown up with me, he would have taken all of the black licorice that I had and traded it for something that I wanted because he absolutely loves the stuff. So, Eric, you are some kind of mutant. That's the only conclusion I can draw. Okay, and let's see. And here's a good one here from Mary. She writes that when she was a kid, her house was the most popular on the block for trick-or-treating because her parents always gave away full-size candy bars.
Damn, your parents were loaded.
The particular neighborhood favorites were Baby Ruth and the Hershey's cookies and cream bars.
Ooh, cookies and cream. I've been craving that lately, actually.
I just love white chocolate in general.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what it is, but like
it's cocaine. I mean,
yeah, it has to be. But I absolutely detest anything dark chocolate, a trait that I share with Sally, who writes that she cannot eat anything dark chocolate because it tastes like something that goes in the toilet.
I don't think any of us are fans of dark chocolate. I got some for my birthday and I ate it, but it's not my favorite thing in the world.
Like I can eat dark chocolate like cake. I guess because there's other stuff in there to just balance out the bitterness of the flavoring. But like dark chocolate candy bars, I can't go anywhere near them. Just can't eat the stuff. Okay, and let's see. Here's one that I've kind of unusual. I've never heard of anybody giving these out. But Ben writes that the weirdest piece of Halloween candy he ever got was a pack of chiclets. So I was like, I can't recall ever seeing Halloween-sized chiclet packs. So
interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, I remember gum being one of those do not accept items from when I was a kid. So, which is weird because again, blow pops and Hubba Bubba.
Mm-hmm.
So, but for some reason, I just have this memory of being told, not to accept gum. Okay. And so that's we got a lot of great responses for that discussion topic. And so now for this week's random topic, again, keeping with the Halloween theme, I thought it would be fun to discuss scary stories. And of course, you go into a bookstore now, and of course, all the stores now, they have all the Halloween stuff out with the Christmas stuff just behind the shelf waiting to come out exactly at 12:01 on November 1st. So, but you have all like the horror story showcases now, and I went down to my local Barnes & Noble to pick up a book that I've been waiting for, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Kat, when you were growing up, do you remember the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series?
Of course, I was traumatized by the covers and the interior art, just like every other 90s kid.
For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series was a series of these juvenile, little kids level horror stories, and they all came in these black covers with these black and white pencil drawing covers and print in bright blood red. And there was there must have been 100 of these books. But they were everywhere when I was a kid. Those and Goosebumps. Those were the big kids books that everybody was looking to get around Halloween when we were coming up. And I thought it would be fun to discuss some of our favorite scary stories. They could be ones from the books, or they could be ones we just heard around the campfire. So talk about some of those neat scary stories from when we were kids that we really liked. So Kat, what's a particular scary story that you remember that stuck with you that sticks in your memory?
Oh gosh. I remember, okay, so I don't put me, on a stake and burn me for this, but I never read Goosebumps as a kid because I skipped straight to Fear Street, which is probably not something I should have done. It's probably why I'm such a macabre person at times. But
now you'll have to bring me up to speed because I don't remember Fear Street.
Fear Street was the young adult version of Goosebumps.
Okay.
Whereas Goosebumps was for kids, I was at the age level meant for Goosebumps, but reading Fear Street, which was meant for teens.
Now, just out of curiosity, was this also R.L. Stine, or was this somebody else?
Yes.
Okay.
So the Fear Street books were a lot in the same vein. They didn't get quite as weird. There was a little bit more psychological horror. With Fear Street, and there was sort of a recurring plot because Fear Street literally took place on Fear Street. Everything that happened in it was related to this one particular town and a town curse and everything.
Wow, I'd hate to be a real estate agent in that town.
Right? It's like living in Sunnydale. You're basically on a hellmouth.
Or Castle Rock, as we will be discussing later.
Yes, it's you can't sell a house here, and so many plots of them were some new kid comes to town. I'm like, but why? But anyway, there was a pair of books that I really liked. There was The Stepsister and The Stepsister 2, and it was this really strange psychological horror book. That it's actually, of the Fear Street books, it's the one that sticks out the most because I've never had a sister, much less a stepsister. But it's this psychological horror of a girl whose parent remarries. I think it was her mom remarried. No, her dad. her dad remarried or something like that. But in any case, she ends up with a stepsister, and she's kind of excited about it at first, and then like terrible stuff starts happening, and she feels like her new stepsister is trying to kill her, and everything is just suspicious as hell, and she goes through all of this really awful stuff, and it's this sort of like home horror stuff that sort of stuck with me, even though it's really not that scary, but it's the psychological part of it where, you know, can you trust people really if you don't know them that well? And did she or didn't she do it, sort of thing. That I just really enjoyed that one. I kind of want to go to the library and find it and reread it. Because there was a lot of stuff that it's like, oh, there's a four-post bed and she sees a scary shadow outside of it, kind of like very visual horror. The one that always really stuck with me, though, was that the stepsister draws the main girl a bath and throws some like bath salts in it just to make things like nice, and the main character stares at it for a long time trying to decide if she thinks that there's something strange about the bath, like it smells nice and it has this off color because of the bath salts, and she's like, no, I'm not gonna risk it, it's gonna be fucking poisoned, I just know it. And then she's like, yeah, no, I don't feel like taking a bath. So the stepsister just gets on in, and you're like, oh man, there's like so many twists.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you my favorite scary story from when I was a kid, and I remember it exactly because I remember it just fucked me up. I heard this when I was like 7 years old on like a Cub Scout camping trip, and it's called The Green Ribbon. And it's one of those ones that you find in, like, you know, those scary stories to tell in the dark books, which I'm pretty sure is where the Scoutmaster got it from. But it's about this boy named, I think his name is Harold, and he meets this girl when he's about 8 years old named Jenny, who he becomes very fast friends with. They grow up together, but she's always wearing this green ribbon around her neck. And he asks her why she always wears it and why she never takes it off. And she always says, I'm sorry, I can't tell you why I wear this green ribbon. Maybe one day I'll tell you. So they wind up staying friends. They start dating in high school. They go to senior prom. He asks her there again, you know, now that we're romantically together, can you please tell me why you wear this green ribbon? And she says, no, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. One day I will tell you, though. They keep on dating, they get married, and on the day of their wedding, he asks her, you know, can you please tell me now why you always wear this green ribbon and you never take it off? And she says, no, I'm sorry, I can't tell you, but one day I promise you I will. They live their lives together, they grow old, and finally, you know, Jenny's on her deathbed and she's about to expire, and Harold is sitting next to the bed with her as she gets ready to pass. And finally she says, now, you know, Henry, it's time for me to tell you why I wear this green ribbon. Go ahead and untie the ribbon and take it off of me. And with shaking hands, he reaches over and he undoes the knot, removes the green ribbon, and Jenny's head fell off.
I remember this story. Oh man.
And I remember that just fucked me up as a kid, because like it's the fridge horror of it that this girl, that Jenny's been wearing this ribbon since she was a child. So like she got beheaded as a child and then the head was reattached, and like me just imagining the backstory behind this just completely fucked me up. So yeah, what about so any other particular scary stories that you remember?
Oh man, you know, my mom would tell me the story about, there is a place where she nearish where she grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, called Zombie Road. And I've talked about this on like one of our super old episodes. So if you've been one of our longtime listeners, you've heard about Zombie Road before. But Zombie Road, and that's not what it's actually called anymore. But every single like folk story that you can think of about, like every scary story you can think about, there is a story about that on Zombie Road. And like the main, in historical context, there is it leads up to like a rock quarry that leads down to a river. And it's said, And this is probably true, that that back during the Civil War, some soldiers tried to cross the river and it was too high and too cold, and many of them drowned. So they say if you're out by the river, you can see the ghosts of these soldiers. I think Confederate soldiers. And there's also like a traditional woman in white story where if you are driving down the road, you will see a like a spectral woman trying to wave you down, and then if you park and try to go out to help her, she just disappears. But the main story for Zombie Road, the where it gets its name from, is it was said that there was an asylum nearby. And this is a heavily wooded road and everything. It's exactly what you expect for like a hook hand murder kind of story. But it is said that there was an asylum nearby, and one of the inmates escaped, and he was called the Zombie. He wasn't actually a zombie, he was just called Zombie. And that he would wander along the road and kill people. And you know, like, you shouldn't go alone there at night because the zombie will take you. Stuff like that. Sorry, I'm moving around in my seat. It sounds like farty noises. And those are all stories. You know, people have said they've seen this or that. What has actually genuinely happened that you can find in the news is that there was a brief period of satanic cults. Some cultists, I guess, bought into all of the hype around it, and there is a cliff, and some people, you would go up there, and it was probably, some of it was a little bit half and half, half actual stuff, half people pranking. But if you used to be able to access the top of this cliff, and that is where some groups would gather. You could go up there, there would be like satanic symbols drawn all over the place.
Don't ask why the Kool-Aid tastes funny.
Yeah. Kind of and again, like, some of this might be just like kids playing pranks to make it look like satanic cultists, but somebody actually did die. Somebody fell off the cliff during some sort of secretive meetup, and nobody would, you know, come forward to talk about it. But it's such an interesting place, and you are no longer allowed to go there at night because so many people used to come down for ghost watching and that sort of thing. It was like a dare thing that you would do. You would dare each other to drive down Zombie Road, and my mom would call it a Chinese fire drill, but it'd be where you stop in the middle of the road, everybody gets out and switches seats. Yeah. And she went down one time, and her and her twin sister and their friend all got out of the car, but none of the men would actually get out of the car because they were too scared. And the girls were all like, "Get out, move, fine." But it's such an interesting place, and they. At Halloween every year, they put out warnings saying the park closes at 6 o'clock. If you're found out here afterwards, you will be arrested. I mean, it's not really a park, but like, there's a little bit of a park, and like a walking trail and stuff. But there's so much mystique around it that people want to go there at night, and they're not allowed to, and you will get arrested. So please don't do this if you live in the area. But my mom would just tell me all kinds of stories about it, and I loved hearing about it. And it's probably all bullshit, but it's like one of St. Louis's few claims to fame.
All right. Okay, all right. But yeah, so now we turn it over to you, our listeners. What is your favorite scary story from you were a kid? Or, you know, what was your favorite Goosebumps or Goosebumps book or Fear Street book? Or what was your favorite scary story to tell in the dark? So yeah, let's hear from you. And so with that segment ran a bit long, so we're going to just keep Ask a Geek a little bit short here. So we got a question here for each of us. So Kat, we're going to ask yours first. And this one comes from Erica. And she asked if you are a fan of any Junji Ito manga, or if you've read any of his manga or seen any movies based upon them.
I am actually not a Junji Ito fan. And it's not have anything to do with his works. It's just that I don't really like horror. Even though we're about to talk about Stephen King, I'm not a huge horror fan, and I really don't read much in the way of horror manga. I actually have a traumatizing thing about horror manga where you should definitely not read it before you go to bed.
Oh, I know what's coming.
It's a fucking koala story, man. I've told this story so many times, but that's literally, I don't do very much in the way of horror manga, period, much less, like, I don't really do, like, much horror anime either. It's not really my forte. That being said, I have seen the Uzumaki film. That was one of those things where somebody forced me to watch it, and I'm like, what the actual fuck is happening here? It's very surreal, man. It's so weird. And yeah, I'm just not a horror fan. That being said, we're going to talk about Stephen King here in a minute and all the things we've seen of Stephen King's, but Japanese horror is really strange.
Yeah, that's I cannot think of a single Japanese horror film that I have sat through without having to stop and just like take a walk at some point and just shake it off. The one that really fucked me up was I think it was called Audition. I think that was a movie. I don't know. I've seen a bunch because a mutual friend of ours is just like fucking into this shit like Flint. And you know, she just absolutely loves this kind of fucked up shit, and she's shown so much of this stuff to me that it's all kind of blurred together in one traumatizing soup. But there's a scene in this one movie, and I think it was Audition, but I might be wrong, where this girl's jaw falls off, and you see just her tongue just lolling out of this hole in her throat, and I'm just like, nope, that's it. This is where I tap out. Nope, I gotta walk away from this. And Kat, I think you know who I'm talking about, because like I said, this is a mutual friend of ours.
Yeah, I know exactly. As soon as you said she, I'm like, oh yeah, I know.
Okay. But yeah, yeah. Like I said, there's something in the water over there. And let's see. Our last question here is for me. This one comes from Barry, and he asks if I've heard about Analog's new retro console, the Mega SG. This is just something that was announced, if not today, then in the last couple of days. And what it is Analog basically makes retro consoles. They're famous for making the Super NT, which is a really high-end console that plays NES and Super Nintendo games. And they're really known in the retro community for making enthusiast products because their stuff is really high quality, but it's also really pricey. And they just announced that they're making the Mega SG, which is a Sega retro console that plays Mega Drive and Genesis and Master System games. And the thing that distinguishes them from stuff like, say, the Hyperkin Retron 5 is they're actually trying to recreate the original Sega hardware instead of using emulation or, you know, Famicloning. And I kind of my feelings towards the Mega SG are the same ones that I have towards the Super NT and the rest of Analog stuff, in that I acknowledge that it's really great merchandise, but the thing is that, like, you know, once you pass the price point of about $140, it's really hard for me to justify buying something like that can only play maybe a couple of systems when I've got a Retron 5 that can play like 7. Now, there is wisdom in purchasing something that actually recreates the original hardware as opposed to using emulation like the Retron 5 does. In that you're, you know, getting a slightly more true experience playing these games on a recreation of the original hardware. But again, it's just like I said, that price point and the utility of it. So I don't think I'll ever get one. But at the same time, I can see why it would be attractive to somebody who's looking to start maybe an exclusively Sega collection. And yeah, on the other hand, you know, I gotta say, you know, see that the Sega community being thrown a bone, because so much of the retro gaming industry, which is really the only term I can really put towards people who produce Famiclone consoles and stuff for retro gaming, so much of it is geared towards Nintendo. This is actually a conversation that me and Skyblaze had a few weeks ago, where we were like, you know, I can walk in any store and buy, you know, wireless NES controllers or wireless Super Nintendo controllers, but why can't I get like a wireless version of the 6-button Genesis pad? Where's all the Sega stuff? So, you know, maybe if this is successful, we'll start seeing some more bones thrown towards the Sega community. So, you know, while I personally won't get probably won't get a Mega SG for myself, I do see it as kind of a step in the right direction as far as, you know, how the retro community, you know, maybe it'll be a sign of things to come. Maybe more stuff will start coming out for the Sega community in the near future. Now, I will say that if they come out with a console that can play Sega CD or Sega Saturn games, I am buying that shit like first day retail, because I absolutely want like a Sega CD console that isn't like 30 years old and about to die on me. So yeah. But yeah, so those are all the questions that we have for time for this week. Thank you as always for sending them in. As always, you can send them to us through the email at drgonzo@nerdofthethirdpower.com. We love getting your questions, love reading them on the air. So get your questions in. You might just get it read on the air. And so, leaping from our random topic of scary stories to an author of scary stories, this week we are discussing Stephen King, and more specifically the series Castle Rock, which is on Hulu. It's a 10-episode television series set within the Stephen King verse. So we're going to talk about the show, as well as the man himself, and you know, some of the stories of his that we really enjoy. And yeah, it's going to be a fun time. So, and Kat, this is actually a subject that you suggested.
Yeah, I don't know why. Well, actually, I do know why, but I really wanted to watch this show. I'm not super familiar with the Stephen King universe. I've watched a bunch of the movies. I haven't actually read any of the books, which is like a crime against humanity for somebody who used to read as much as I did. But my mom was a big Stephen King fan, so that's why I ended up watching so much Stephen King. You know, when I was younger, I'd seen, you know, I accidentally watched stuff like The Stand. I was way too young when I watched the original It and all this other stuff. So when Hulu announced that they were going to have a Stephen King universe set series, my mom got a Hulu subscription and said, here's the login information. I'm going to watch this Stephen King show called Castle Rock. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I'll start watching it. So I watched it week by week as it came out, and I actually found myself really getting into it. And it was less like, well, it's horror. It's still horror, but it's mainly this kind of psychological horror that I really enjoy, where you really don't understand who or what the villain is. There's not a whole lot that gets specifically defined, but there's a lot of malevolent evil going on, but you can't really figure out how or why. And yeah, I just thought it was going to be really fun. And then I said, hey, we should talk about this in October when it's spooky time.
Yeah, so for those who don't know what we're referring to when we talk about the Stephen King universe, Stephen King likes to set a lot of his stories in his home state of Maine, and a recurring theme that runs through a lot of his work is the town of Castle Rock in Castle County, and a lot of his books are set in and around this area. And you know, a lot of, and it's even stuff that might not necessarily, that isn't horror. Some of his other stuff is in it, like Stand By Me, which was like a coming of age story, or Shawshank Redemption, which was kind of a hopeful drama, you know, set in the Shawshank prison there. And it's none of the books that King writes are ever directly connected to each other. Like, none of them are really direct sequels to each other. But occasionally you'll see, you know, characters in one book kind of make bit appearances in another, or you'll hear these sly references to events in another novel that was set in the same area. And Castle Rock basically takes this concept and just runs with it. I've read a few Stephen King books that were set in this area. Like, I read Cujo, and I read I'm trying to think, what was the other one, because I didn't get a chance to read it for this one. But it was the one about the Strangler that gets referred to, that Molly actually lives in the house that the Strangler lived in. And you know, it's neat to watch this series and see all of these little mythology gags that they put in, these allusions to Stephen King stories. Like, you hear them talk about, like, you know, the rabid dog that tore through town. You know, that's Cujo. Or I think at one point there was a reference to Misery in there that I thought I caught, but I wasn't sure if I was catching the right thing or if I was making a mistake. But it's a really interesting series, and from what I've seen it, I've really enjoyed it so far. There's just one kind of real thing that I'm kind of disappointed by, but we'll get to that as we get later on into the series. But Kat, what about you? What are your general thoughts on Castle Rock?
I really enjoyed it. It has this. There's a certain frustration of watching something Stephen King because you know that you might not ever get answers to all of your questions, and this one raises an awful lot of questions, and it actually did piss a lot of people off because it doesn't answer very many of them. But it does have such a Stephen King feel to it, where there's this, you know, there's an undefined, unspecified evil, and as soon as you think you understand any part of it, something changes, and then you're not quite so sure anymore. And I think that's part of what I really loved about it, was every time I felt like I had a grasp of what was going on, and you know, I watched this with my friends, and when we would we'd come up with theories of what we thought was really going on, and as soon as I thought I had it nailed, the next episode would air, and we'd be like, what the heck? Like, I literally screamed at the television. I've never watched a show that made me want to throw the remote at the TV so badly, because there's so many really, really juicy cliffhangers at the ends of the episodes that change everything. Like, it's not just like, oh, here's a little revelation and that changes the way you look at character. It's like, here's a revelation, here's a whole episode about it, and now everything that you thought was true is no longer true. It's really crazy, but really entertaining.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen you get this pumped about a show since Voltron.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I got really into the show for the couple of weeks that it was airing. It was really fun to watch.
All right. So let's start breaking the show down to its component pieces. So let's start by talking a bit about the plot. So Kat, do you want to give the breakdown, or do you want me to do it?
I can give it, but you'll probably take over because I'm really bad at it. So the story mainly revolves around an attorney named Henry Matthew Deaver, and we find out through a series of flashbacks, and this show has many, many, many flashbacks. You find out that when Henry was a child, he had been adopted into a family, and his adopted father was a priest. And one day, Henry had gone missing, and his father, or both he and his father had gone missing, and his father ended up dead. And Henry was missing for so long that everybody thought that he was also dead. And Henry was eventually found, and everybody believed in this town that Henry killed his father. And so, along with being the only black kid in town, he was heavily ostracized for the murder of his father that there's no way he could have done. He was just a kid. So he eventually leaves town, and has a career outside. And this is set in, again, Castle Rock, Maine. And he moves to Texas. And he comes back at the behest of what was he? A
corrections. Yeah, corrections officer. A
corrections officer at the Shawshank State Penitentiary. Because the Shawshank prison has found, while exploring a unused portion of the prison, they found a cage. And they found a young man in that cage. And they didn't know what to do with this kid, because the last warden probably kept him down there, but the last warden at the very beginning of the episode kills himself. And so the new warden and the other people in prison think that this kid had something, there was something about him that the warden felt guilty over, and there was probably, no matter which way they spun it, it was going to be bad if anybody found out that this kid existed. So they made it very clear that they were intending to either keep this kid in the prison or just off him.
And that's where shit goes crazy.
Right. So one person in the prison with a soul ends up calling Henry Matthew Deaver to come in, specifically because the kid that they find in the cage, who is generally referred to as the kid, when asked his name, says Henry Matthew Deaver. And everybody knows, well, most people know that that's not who he is. Most people know about Henry Deaver. So this guard calls Henry and says, hey, there's this kid who's been locked up in a cage. We don't know how long he's been there, but he said your name. And Henry's a really good person. You know, he works as a criminal law attorney for capital punishment cases. So he's really got a soft spot in his heart for hard luck. So he comes home to his hometown where everyone hates him and tries to get this kid out of prison. And that's like how the basic gist of it goes. It's the story of him getting this kid out of prison and the weird, awful, horrific stuff that happens in this town. And there's a couple of subplots of like, why was this kid in the cage? There is a subplot of Henry's mom she has Alzheimer's, basically, right?
Yeah.
And she's also seeing the former sheriff of the town, who everybody still goes to with their problems.
Who is Alan Pangborn, who's appeared in who's been a major player in a couple of Stephen King novels, for those of you who are aficionados of King's books.
Yeah, so that's an interesting little aside. There is the subplot of a woman who Henry had known. They were kids at the same time. They were neighbors. And there's a girl named Molly, and she has some abilities.
Which the only way I can really describe it is psychic empathy. She hears what other people are feeling. So she's Deanna Troi without the mental control.
Yes. So there's a subplot about her and how when they were kids, she had a huge crush on Henry. But it was her psychic abilities were so closely attuned to his existence that it was overpowering for her to be around him. And yeah, so there's a lot going on, and not all of it gets wrapped up, but it has been greenlit for a second season, so that's something we can talk about later, what we'd like to see.
Yeah, and another thing that gets revealed as the series goes on is that there's I won't give away spoilers, but there's something about this kid that wherever he goes, bad shit happens, and it's eventually revealed. The initial theory about the kid when they first find him is that he was the warden's toy, to put it mildly. But it later turns out that the warden thought this kid was the literal devil. Because everywhere he goes, bad shit happens, and it's pointed out that there is something not quite right about this kid, but it's also shown that the kid isn't really exactly in control about what's going on. So that gets kind of freaky down the line. I enjoyed this series as I was watching it. Going on into our general thoughts, to give my general thoughts on it, the one thing that really kept kind of sticking out to me, and this is something that I said I was disappointed, but it's really more kind of I feel bad for this series because it's carrying a burden that I think is going to hamper it in the long run, and that's that I kept on making subconscious comparisons to Stranger Things while I was watching this series, and the more I watched this series, the more I noticed that there were things here that I felt like were put in to try and win over the Stranger Things crowd. Like, you know, the kid is basically 11, a male version of 11 that's been aged up about 10 years. This mysterious child who has these strange abilities that everything centers around, and everyone's trying to figure out, who they are and where they came from. And I really kind of feel bad for the series now, because now I feel like it's got this bar that it has to clear. And anyone who's going to watch is now going to make comparisons to Stranger Things without letting it stand on its own merits, which are quite good. I mean, to be fair, like I said, this series isn't really my speed, and I don't know if I'll follow it into its second season, but that's more just my personal preference than a knock against the series itself. One thing I do like, and this is something that we talked about a few minutes ago, is, again, like I said, all the little mythology gags to Stephen King's work in his universe. Like at one point, we're introduced to Jackie Torrance, who is the assistant of Molly, the woman with the psychic empathy. And it's revealed in episode 5 that she's actually the niece of Jack Torrance, who, if you've ever seen The Shining, that was Jack Nicholson's character. And she talks about how, like, oh, my parents, they never talk about how my uncle went fucking nuts at this ski resort and tried to axe murder his wife and kid. And it's like, there's all these neat little nods to King's other work that it's really a continuity enthusiast wet dream, this series, because there's at least one reference in every episode to another King work, and it almost becomes kind of a game trying to find the references.
It's definitely one of those shows where immediately after it's done, there's a huge article, Easter eggs you missed in this show.
Think pieces abound, yes. But one of the things that I think the series does very well is, like you said, Kat, is that there's no one, how can I put this? There's no one major villain that, drives the whole plot. There's no one major central MacGuffin that around which everything revolves. It's just weird. The town itself, there's just something weird about it that causes all of these happenings. And I like that there's that nebulousness to it, which kind of, I think, adds to the horror, that it's like, okay, is this kid actually himself, like, a nexus of evil, or is it the town itself? Because, as the series goes on, there's this sort of atmosphere of, oppressiveness that just keeps bearing down. Like halfway through the series, it's a very big deal is made of the fact that there's this wildfire that's going on outside the town, and it's spreading. And no one, no efforts to fight it are successful. So it's just like, as the series goes on, you just get this sense that things are just getting worse and worse, and nobody fucking knows why.
Yeah, man, there's a lot to unpack in this. And there's a lot you haven't seen. There's so much you haven't seen.
Yeah, although I've read enough to know what happened, so don't worry about spoiling anything for me. Although we're going to go ahead and sound the spoiler alarm for our viewers at this point, because what's going to follow will probably reveal some major things about the series. We've tried to keep things kind of surface level up to this point, but from this point on, you've been warned, there will be spoilers. So, Kat, what was a moment for you that you mentioned one where you wanted to throw your remote at the television? What was that moment for you?
Oh God, the first holy shit moment. The big holy shit moment comes in episode 5, where the guard, who is trying to help the kid, and you see him starting to have some hope throughout the early episodes, where he's a good guy. He's not all bought into the system. He's not just living his life day to day. He wants a little bit more out of life, and he wants to do the right thing by the kid, and trying to get him out of the prison and testify against the prison for all the shit that they do that's awful. And as the episode goes on, things just sort of don't go his way. And he's repeatedly told, would it kill you to smile? Would you just smile already? And he gets so sick of it, so sick of all of the bullshit, he goes on a killing spree and murders all of the other guards, and then eventually is himself shot and killed. And it came out of nowhere. Like, well, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was building up for an episode or episode and a half or so. But it was the first time where you realize that, man, this town is really messed up. There's been, like smaller things that are really odd, things that are a little bit scary. But this was the first time where you just go, oh my God, this show is going to have a death toll. Like, it's going to be a high one because a bunch of people died in that. so many people died in that. And then it just ended right there. And I just wanted to chuck my remote across the room because I needed to know what happened after that. That was just madness.
And then you find out with the explanation as to what that is, or at least, you know, it was intuit from my reading, and it becomes even more heartbreaking because you realize that, like, it wasn't even his own. He wasn't really in control of his actions when he did this. The moment that really kind of the moment where I had to kind of put things on pause and kind of walk away for a bit was the birthday party scene. And for those that you know, again, spoiler warning, it's eventually kind of hinted over the course of the series that the kid has this malign influence that he cannot control, that people around him are forced to give in to, or manipulated, or basically they give in to their basic instincts, or their negative feelings and emotions are amplified to the point where they become overpowering. And there's a scene halfway through the series after the prison finally just goes, fuck it, get this kid off our hands, and they just release him. And Molly and Henry put him up in this kind of apartment, used in the loosest sense of the word. It's basically a warehouse that they put an inflatable bed in for him to spend the night in. And he goes wandering out into town, just kind of looking around, and he wanders into a family, a house of family that's having a birthday party for their like 5-year-old son. And he just stands in the doorway watching this party, and the camera doesn't focus on what's going on, but you hear the parents go from, oh yay, happy birthday, oh open your presents buddy, to fucking killing each other in the space of like 15 seconds. And it's you know, you watch the kid's reaction and how he's disturbed by this, and you really get this sense as you watch this that, like, this is something that he's seen play out, and that he feels that he is somehow responsible for, or would want to stop, but he doesn't know how to shake this influence that he has on the people around him. And he just doesn't want to cause anyone any suffering, but everywhere he goes, like I said, just bad shit happens all around him. And you kind of get the sense that there is something to the dead warden's words, that wherever he goes, he drags evil behind him. And it's such a horrifying scene, because it's one of the things that King does really well and is carried over into this scene is he does tell but not show in a way that works where most people wouldn't. And the thing is, like, in this scene, you don't see anything that's going on. You just hear the parents screaming at each other, sounds of a struggle. There's a baby screaming, and it's all just so heartbreaking and terrifying. I had to pause the show and go take a walk for a bit at that moment.
Yeah, it was such a strange scene, because you get the feeling, oh, something bad is going to happen. But you don't see the kid actually do anything. He really does cause, everywhere he goes, evil follows. And there's so many questions about the kid, because it really does, especially in the early episodes, seem like at first that he is malevolent and that he is causing bad things to happen. And then it sort of starts to seem like bad things just happen around him. And one of the things that we're told very early on, in a voiceover by the old warden, is that every time something bad would happen in this town, people would say, it wasn't me, it was this town. And it's sort of taking the blame off of the person who did whatever terrible thing that they did and putting it on some sort of undefined force inside the town that makes people do bad things. And you start to, you know, once the kid is introduced, you start to think, this kid is something different. There's something about him, and Warden Lacey believes that this kid is what is causing so much evil. He literally thinks this kid. He's not actually a child. He thinks this kid is the devil. And you watch it and you go, well, I don't think he's the devil, but there's certainly something about him. And it takes a long time to sort of get to where there's any kind of backstory for the kid. But the more you find out about him, the more that he is not normal. one of the earliest things, not earliest, but somewhere maybe mid-series, you find out is that that the kid was actually locked up for 27 years. And in that time, he did not age.
Yeah, that's for context. He's called the kid. He looks to be about like college age, like 19, 20. So, and there's a moment where Alan Pangborn, who by this point is an old man, confronts the kid and is like, "Look, I saw you in Lacey's trunk 27 years ago, and you have not aged a fucking day." Because it's revealed very early that Pangborn knows about the kid. Because he actually confronts the new warden in the bar and tells her, "Look, don't let that fucking kid out." So it's clear that he's aware of it. But that was the moment, you know, again, it's never established how long he's known. It's, you know, so you think, okay, this is something recent that, you know, he's known about, that just had, you know, it's something the warden's been doing. You know, just kind of, this kid might be one of many, because like I said, at this point, the overriding theory is still going that this kid has been the warden's toy. But now you realize that this is a point where it comes like, okay, no, Pangborn's known about this kid for nearly 30 years. So there's definitely some wacky shit going on here. Wacky used very, very loosely in this case.
Right. So the show is amazing in that it keeps redefining what you think about the kid, what you think he might be. You know, is evil attracted to him? Is he like a nexus of it? Is he himself evil? And also one of the really interesting things, and we're basically just talking about the characters at this point. But one of the really cool things about the kid, and specifically Bill Skarsgård, who plays him, is that he has such an unnaturalness about him. I mean, this is the guy that they hired to play Pennywise in the new It. So there's already something about him that's
they're certainly getting their money's worth, let me tell you.
Yeah. But when the kid comes out of the cage, he doesn't speak. He barely makes eye contact. He can't socialize. He can barely, you know, he's barely human at that point because he has been so degraded from being kept in that cage the whole time. And so you're immediately meant to feel sympathy for him because you look at everything that he is and you can easily see this being the result of captivity. And the further you get, the more that he talks, the more that you realize he knows stuff. He's aware of things. He's not incompetent. He's not anything that you might think about him. He's probably not. He's not, I don't know, handicapped in any way. He's actually quite clever, but he's been quiet this whole time. And so you sort of wonder, oh, has he been hiding this whole time, or legitimately traumatized and is having to relearn how to socialize and remember things? It's such a brilliant thing to watch. I've probably watched this half of the show I've watched like twice at least, because I watched it and then I watched it with a friend. So it's a really incredible evolution of a character that the kid goes through. But go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I was
going to say, but the kid's story is inextricably tied with Henry Deaver's character. And it becomes more and more apparent, especially at the end, that they have something. There's something between them that you can't quite put your finger on. And the first, you know, like the very first episode, the kid says that his name is Henry Matthew Deaver, and everybody interprets that as he's asking for a lawyer. And that's what ends up happening. Henry comes to see him, becomes his lawyer, gets him out of the state penitentiary, gets him out of Shawshank, and takes care of him, and is trying his best to help him, even though he finds the kid kind of off-putting, because the kid's behavior is very weird. But he does genuinely want to help him, and it gets more apparent as it goes on that the kid is somehow connected to the Deaver family, even though it is very unclear.
And connected not just to Henry, but to Henry's disappearance as a child, because a subplot that runs through this is Henry also trying to kind of stumbling into the role of trying to solve the mystery of his own disappearance when he was a child, because, you know, it's established that he doesn't remember anything prior to him being found on the lake by Sheriff Pangborn when he was 11 years old. So it's a case of him trying to find out what actually happened to him. And at one point, he thinks he's found the home of the man he believes is his kidnapper, and he goes to visit that house. And at first, you know, it looks like it's going to be a false alarm. The person who lives there is just this kindly old barber who just inherited the house from his brother, who was a convict with a felony record. Which is what drew Henry to the house in the first place, was the fact that this house belonged to, you know, a criminal. And it turns out, no, the guy who lives there is just the guy's brother, and he's just this kindly old barber. So when the barber guy figures out that he's talking to the missing Deaver boy, he takes Henry up into the attic and shows him this box that he's had that's got Henry's police file and all the details of the case. And Henry's like, "Why the fuck do you have this?" And he's like, "Oh, so I could read about what they said about me." And at this point, you're like, "Oh shit, this is actually the kidnapper, and he's going to do some horrible thing to Henry." And he tells a story about how, like, you know, they came and they took my brother's finger bones because they thought they were yours, and, you know, all these insinuations. And you know, I'm glad that you're here because, you know, I never laid a hand on you. And it's like, oh no, okay, so this guy was accused of taking Henry, but he didn't actually do it. And this is going back to, you know, what Kat was saying earlier about how this show will set you up to believe something and then yank the rug out from under you and completely, you know, realize that everything that you knew was wrong. And here the show does it 3 times in rapid succession, all in the space of like 10 minutes.
Yeah. God. And everything about Henry's disappearance is very strange, because he disappeared in Maine in the middle of winter, in, you know, around a lake, and it had been an unusually cold winter, and he was missing for 11 days. And, you know, when he's a kid and he's found by Sheriff Pangborn tells him, "How did you do? You're warm. You should have frozen to death." And so there's a great mystery because Henry doesn't remember. He doesn't remember going missing or anything. He doesn't remember anything at all. And how did he survive? And that's part of this great big mystery. How did he survive when his father did not? And the further you go into it, the more you see how strange his father was. His father was very like, you find out his father was very abusive. His father thought he heard things in the woods and wanted Henry to hear them as well. And his father was a priest, and he thought this sound that he could hear in the woods was like the voice of God. And then this becomes a whole subplot later on where there is a group of people who really think that this sound that you, can hear when you're out in the woods, that is basically sounds like when you have tinnitus, it's like a ringing, is God. And if you and there's certain people who have been chosen to hear it, and Henry has tinnitus or something along those lines, and hears this ringing in the woods. And this becomes this whole thing where it's implied that the woods around this town are somehow different. And by the end of the series, you can kind of, this is not a normal place. This is a place that is potentially, and this is where it gets really even kingy, that these woods are where time and space is like intersecting with one another, or where like realities, like different parallel worlds and timelines are all meeting in one place. And it gets really weird at that point.
Yeah. So anyway, so with that, that's about the time we have to discuss the show itself. So let's wrap up our thoughts on on Castle Rock itself, and we'll move on to discussing Stephen King in general. So, Kat, what are your final general thoughts about Castle Rock, and how recommended would you say you give it?
I'd highly, highly recommend it if you enjoy any kind of cerebral horror, if you suspense, and if you enjoy anything Stephen King or J.J. Abrams, because J.J. Abrams was the director on the show. It's very good. So basically, if you like Lost season 1 or anything by Stephen King, it's a really good show. I recommend watching it. There's a lot of really stellar acting and incredible writing in it, and it's a really good thing to just have right around October.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm gonna say it's definitely an enjoyable series. Like I said, not exactly my speed. But like I said, that's more down to my personal preference than anything against the show itself. So I'd recommend you people at least check it out. The one caveat that I will give is try to leave Stranger Things at the door. Try not to do as I wound up doing, subconsciously comparing it to Stranger Things, because there are some similarities, but this is a show that really deserves to be tested on its own merits rather than being prejudged based on another show.
It's so funny that you judged it against Stranger Things and All I Lost, because it's so J.J. Abrams and it's got Terry O'Quinn in it and everything. And I didn't pick up on any similarities to Stranger Things at all.
Well, I mean, maybe that's just my subconscious desire for Stranger Things season 3. Why don't we have it already?
Soon.
So with that, let's move on to start talking about Stephen King himself. And it's pretty fair to say that we're having kind of a Stephen King boom lately, because in addition to Castle Rock, we also have the 2-part remake of Stephen King's It. That we've gotten the first part already. I think the second part is due out later this year or early next year, somewhere around that time frame.
I want to say early next year.
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing kind of a Stephen King boom. So I guess the question is now put forward is, I guess, what are some of your favorite Stephen King stories, or what are some things some works of his that you particularly enjoy, that you burned through as preparation for this episode? So yeah, what are some Stephen King stories that you've really liked?
I'd say my favorite was probably It, but again, I haven't read any of the books. I only have seen TV shows like the miniseries and movies. It was probably the first one that I saw, and I really enjoyed. I don't know, because it scared the shit out of me too, but I really enjoyed that it was a 2-part kind of story, that there was a story about these people when they were young, and young scrappy kids trying to make their way in the world, and then seeing them later as adults trying to come back to a town that they had forgotten a lot of the horror, because that's how the town works. When you leave it, you kind of forget a lot. And it was kind of cool for me to watch. You know, as a kid, I was watching way too young, watching people grow up and seeing the psychological effects that their own screwed up childhoods, and then this particular event dealing with it and how that affected them as adults. Somehow, like, the psychology of that was very interesting to me.
Okay. Of course, you know, we've mentioned one of the things that gets alluded to in this movie. One of the things that I think everybody has seen, or at least is aware of, and that's The Shining. The movie starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, and how fucked up that was. I still have very vivid memories of just catching as a child. It was playing on television. I just happened to watch it channel surfing. And the scene where the blood comes out of the elevator and spills down the hallway, and how that freaked me out as a child. And I finally saw the movie myself actually last week. I'd actually never seen it before, but now I got to prepare for this episode. I went back and I watched it, and I can see why it is such a highly talked about film. Just the genius of Stephen King's writing combined with Kubrick's filmmaking style was just, it was a match made in heaven. Like, that movie holds up. I could see that movie being released for the first time today and still freaking people the hell out, because that movie is just, its horror comes not from you know, a lot what you see in a lot of horror films today, either, you know, gore or blood or violence, but just from just this general unsettling atmosphere throughout the whole film. And I think that's one of the things that King does really well is his horror is much more oppressive. It's something that's just kind of always there, lingering in the back of your mind, as opposed to just jumping out every now and then to take a swipe at you. So, any other King stories that you really enjoy, Kat?
Gosh, well, in preparation for Carrie, specifically because Carrie, there's so many Stephen King novels and the films based on those novels that are important to cinema, and Carrie is one that it's been remade a couple of times, but it is such an important
which version did you watch? Because there's been like 9.
I watched the original with Sissy Spacek, who, by the way, if you haven't seen Castle Rock, is one of the characters in Castle Rock, as a lovely gesture to Sissy Spacek. God, she's so fabulous in Castle Rock too. But I watched Carrie because I do think it's been one of the most influential horror films of all time. There's the visuals in it of, you know, Carrie being crowned the prom queen and then having the bucket of pig's blood dumped on her and then setting everything on fire is such an amazing, important visual that's really stuck with our pop culture in general. And it's such an interesting film. I had never seen, I'd always seen like the same, like always seen the climax of the film and the end of the, but I've never seen the film the whole way through. So I didn't realize that it was a little more involved than I had originally given it credit for. Particularly in that there's a character who had initially and then convinces her own boyfriend to ask Carrie out to the high school, the prom, and he agrees to do it. And you spend the whole movie while this is wondering what her game is, trying to figure out if she's genuine or if she's trying to set Carrie up for something. And then you find out at the end she was genuine and she really was trying to do right by Carrie. And that boyfriend dies, and this girl is like the one student who fucking survives this annihilation, and it ends up kind of being her story at the end. And I had no idea that this was a whole thing going. The only thing I'd ever really focused on was Carrie, and they're all gonna at you and the blood and everything. So I was really glad that I ended up watching that because I really enjoyed a lot of it. Not all of it, because I don't know what it was about that era where they felt the need to put characters who they are going to label as teenagers and throw them naked on screen a lot. And that was like deeply troubling to watch. But, you know, it happened.
I'll tell you a Stephen King story that really freaks me out, and that's Cujo, and that's the one about the rabid dog. And I read it years ago, and one of the things that I remember really sticking with me in the original novel is the whole story is it's one of King's stories where the horror comes from something completely mundane. There's nothing supernatural about it. The story, it's literally about a dog that gets bit and becomes rabid. But there are parts of the narrative in the novel that are actually told from the dog's perspective as he descends into rabies madness. And, you know, it gets heartbreaking at points because, you know, it's just, he's this dog who's just getting sick, and he is thinking about how, like, oh, this family that's adopted me is going to hate me because I'm a bad dog. And the horror from the book comes from the fact that, again, this is something that's just completely mundane. This is something that could happen anywhere. You know, your dog gets bit by a wild animal, and you have to, and it winds up becoming rabid and mad. And, you know, like, I tell people Cujo is Old Yeller without the happy ending. As if Old Yeller had a happy ending to begin with. It's Old Yeller 2, The Revenge. Is what it is.
Old Yeller.
But it's just, and it's one of those things that I think it's why Stephen King is such a successful horror writer, in that he can make just about anything scary. He doesn't have like okay, you read H.P. Lovecraft, after a while you realize there are certain beats. It's always going to be some eldritch horror from beyond the scope of man, or you read like, say, I can't remember his name, but he writes a series of science fiction horror stories. It's always going to be some kind of alien monster. You know, there are certain beats that you can expect after a while reading a horror author, and over and over again, and realize that they're just kind of repeating the same ideas. But King is able to draw from so many different things, and there are very few of his books that feel like if they're retreading old ground. There's always something new. And I kind of mentioned this before we were talking about the show. One of my favorite Stephen King stories is actually a movie called Duel, which I don't believe was based on the book. I think that was a story that he wrote specifically for motion picture. But it's basically about the road trip from hell. I call it Road Rage, the movie. It's basically about this guy he's on a road trip through the desert, and he winds up running afoul of this semi-truck driver who winds up stalking him and hunting him throughout this entire stretch of highway. And I remember just being, really flipped out by that movie watching it. I think it was about like 13 when I saw it. And then a couple days later, I had to go to a road trip with my dad, and we drove through like, the Arizona desert. And I'm like, oh God, I'm going to die. Because there was like this semi truck that was following us for about like 50 miles.
Oh my God.
So go ahead.
In the opposite of the mundane horror, the most recent one that I've been trying to, because again, it's one that I've never seen, but I had been really, really wanting to rewatch it, is actually The Stand. And I really had been wanting to rewatch it since The Dark Tower came out, because you have this sort of man in black recurring character throughout Stephen King's stories. And I had been wanting to try and, after Castle Rock came out, there was a lot of suspicion that, if this kid is evil, then maybe he has to do with Randall Flagg. And Randall Flagg is sort of like this sort of like devil boogeyman character. He's like the epitome of evil without actually being Satan throughout Stephen King's works. And The Stand is one of the ones where he's a very prevalent character. It's not just a cameo. There's a whole lot of him in it. And so I was really curious about his characterization in The Stand, and how that would all go down. And, because I couldn't remember very much about The Stand. I'd only caught bits and pieces of it on television when my mom was watching it. And again, I was probably a bit too young for a lot of the themes that The Stand has in it, because The Stand has a lot of, it's a apocalyptic plague. There's a lot of themes of like good and evil, but also like a recurring thing where like women get raped and other stuff like that, that I probably shouldn't watch, when I was watching it. But my interest really is not just the dichotomy of good and evil, but the character of Randall Flagg, and how he influences people, and how that compares to other appearances of that same character.
Okay. And of course, the elephant in the room here, Stephen King story that we're specifically not discussing in this episode, because if we do, it really deserves an episode of its own, and that's The Dark Tower, which is probably Stephen King's, well, maybe not his most well-known. I think that honor goes to The Shining just because of the movie, but definitely one of his larger in terms of scale projects. And from what I understand, the one that he is the most passionate about. So if we're going to discuss The Dark Tower, we're going to devote its own episode to it. But anyway, so that's about all the time that we have for this week. So let's start wrapping things up here. So just kind of final thoughts on Castle Rock, Stephen King. Anything else that you'd like to add to finalize the discussion?
Despite sharing a first name with a Stephen King novel, I've never been like an open Stephen King fan, but I made the decision this year for the month of October. I mean, the month of Halloween, let's be real here, that I would just go on a bender and find a bunch of Stephen King to indulge in. And I hit up a half-price bookstore and found a bunch of movies, and I am loving the hell out of it. There's a lot of stuff where I've only seen parts of Stephen King films, so I've only known half the story, and no matter how much you Google stuff, it's always way better to watch the whole thing. So I encourage all of our wonderful listeners that if there's anything, it doesn't have to be Stephen King, but if you're gonna go on a bender with some horror, this is the month to do it. And so many of the Stephen King films are so ingrained in our pop culture and so important to cinematography that fuck you, Stephen King.
All right. For me, Stephen King is one of those authors where I wouldn't say I'm a fan and that I specifically seek out his work. He's really an author that I kind of keep bumping into. It's like I'll pick up this this book or watch this movie that I'll think is really cool, and I'm like, oh, this is Stephen King. Like, to give you the most surprising instance of this, I was shocked when I watched The Green Mile, and I saw based on the novel by Stephen King at the end of it. I'm like, what? He wrote this?
I literally have a copy of that sitting on my desk while I'm recording.
So, but it's surprising because it's so outside the realm of his normal work. But like I said, that he's got a bunch of those. Like I said, Stand By Me is it's like the poster child for the young adult coming of age movie. It's just a bunch of kids going out having an adventure, looking to find a body by the train tracks, like you do, which is referred to in Castle Rock. So he's one of those authors that I keep kind of bumping into. But I mean, his influence on pop culture and especially geek culture it's undeniable. The man is just like a literary force to be reckoned with. And it's very difficult to imagine what our pop culture landscape would be without him, just because of just the all-encompassing influence that he's had. And so with that is all the time that we Power this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. We will see you guys next week. As always, I'm Dr. Gonzo.
I'm the cat.
We will see you next week. Taka, play us out.